This is my supreme pleasure to introduce these panelists. Greg Kidd is a favorite speaker at the Global Investor Conference. Greg has an incredible track record in recognizing trends very early. Greg is a firm believer that one's identity credentials should be truly portable and owned by individuals themselves rather than by companies or governments. The trade-off between security and privacy can meet the needs of both traditional institutions worried about compliance and risk, and also consumer protection advocates who care about the underserved and underbanked. Greg has acted as an advisor and investor for numerous startups in the exchange space, including Ripple, Square, and Twitter, through his seed investment firm, Yaka. He has served as director of Promontory Financial, senior analyst for payments at the Board of Governor of the Federal Reserve, and a senior associate at Booz Allen. Greg is the co-founder of GlobaliD, with a vision where one's identity credentials are truly portable and owned by individuals themselves rather than by companies and governments. I'm excited to also introduce Amit Pradhan. He is a seasoned startup founder, investor, and speaker. He spends time creating, evangelizing, and investing in the future of responsible AI and decentralization. He's a 20-year veteran of Silicon Valley. He's specifically focused on technology, startups, and systems that have a positive impact on the humans they serve. He travels around the world speaking at events to evangelize the need and the path to future societies that are driven by responsible AI. He speaks on privacy, decentralization of power and control, on recognition of bias, and on economic agency in a world that is losing jobs to AI-driven automation at a rate and scale faster than ever before. He's the co-founder and president of the Silicon Valley Blockchain Society, a network of some of the largest investors, thinkers, practitioners, and creators with chapters around the globe. The Society's core mission is to fund the revolution that bears a thoughtful and responsible approach to the impact, value, and culture in the decentralized ecosystem that's converging with AI and other exponential tech. And I love this. The Silicon Valley Society believes, Blockchain Society believes, that a 10-year lens should be applied to any endeavor in this space, whether for consensus and governance, the underlying tech stack, models of financing, or tokenization models. So with that, I'll let you guys take it away.
Howdy, Amit.
Thank you. Hey, howdy, Greg. How are you doing?
Okie dokes.
Yeah,
where are you today? Where are you today?
I am coming to you all from San Juan, Puerto Rico. So I am in the throes of what is now becoming sort of crypto central in a sense. It's Puerto Rico Blockchain Week. So a lot of the different protocols are here, a lot of the different, obviously investors are here. So I'm spending the week here. And where are you?
I'm in Ljubljana, Slovenia today.
You win. I love it. It's such a fantastic city, and it's a lovely growing ecosystem, actually.
It is. It was near here where Bitstamp and the first regulated crypto exchange got going 10 years ago. So we have known it for a while. So I keep coming back. Okay.
It's really interesting. I loved what Deli and Ilana was saying in the context of decentralized identity. I know it's an area that you're deeply focused on, and the ideas of what decentralized identity unlocks once it can be achieved, because it's oftentimes I find that in this space we get into a very binary narrative of centralized control versus decentralized sovereignty. And centralized control then ends up becoming this conversation about, potentially big bad government or big bad, central banks, etc. And then the decentralized argument is about, sovereignty and everything. And, I just find that that conversation is so interesting until you start applying it to very specific use cases, right? And decentralized identity as a concept, we can all get behind. But it's when you start unpacking what that means, what that unlocks in people's lives, in a whole bunch of different use cases, that could well be the daily narrative of the life of the average person, not the 1% that has operated in this world and understands this world. But when we start getting to the lives of the 99%, it's those use cases. That's where it makes a huge difference. And so, I'll give you a quick example, because I know it's something that you care about so deeply and probably have a lot more insight. But I sit on the board of the Norwegian Refugee Council. It is the frontier refugee agency. We go in first whenever there's new conflict, and you can imagine Ukraine now, Mariupol, Donbass, that whole region. And one of the biggest challenges, obviously your Maslow's level 1 is by default. That's what agencies, are there for. That's why they have budget. One of the biggest challenges is identity, right? So you can imagine someone comes from, escapes from Syria, comes to a camp outside in Turkey, doesn't have a passport because, they've fled for their lives. They weren't thinking of carrying a passport. And by the way, even if they did, either they're trying to destroy it so that they can't be tracked by a potentially genocidal leader, or even if they had one and they were happy to show it to you, you don't recognize the issuer, you don't recognize that government, so you cannot validate that ID. And this cycle continues if the camp issues a new ID, because again, it's centralized. Again, if something were to happen and that camp were to shut down, you wouldn't have a verifier anymore. And it's these kind of use cases where you go, yeah, decentralized identity is not just about the concept of self-sovereignty. It's very practical in the lives of what is now over 120 million displaced people in the world.
Yes. So where would you like to go today? And for our panel too, I can dig right in. Shall I just jump in on that, or?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking, Greg, since we're going to talk through DeFi and decentralized ID, and it almost feels like, given the continuation of the conversation, it's probably better to start with the decentralized ID part.
Okay.
And I'll give you a quick example of something we're doing using self-sovereign ID, and as Dele and Ilana were talking about with data. So I run a company called Rainfall, which is basically letting people, or rather we're creating monetization from people's data without ever sacrificing personally identifiable information. So it uses a lot of very clever edge-based AI to create deep context from data. So the idea is, don't get into the business of just selling people's data, or people trying to sell their own data and trying to figure out how to value it and whether it's being used safely or not. And Rainfall basically abstracts it into intelligence, which is what we call real-time social intelligence, because it's data telling the narrative of how people are moving, and makes that intelligence available to businesses, values that intelligence, and then delivers income back to the wallets where the data came from. And it fills a lot of the items that Dele and Ilana were talking about in the concept of how you create agency and choice. And but all of this has to happen with decentralized self-sovereign identity, because otherwise your starting point fails everyone, right? Because it becomes a centralized identity system. And obviously this is something that you work on a lot. So happy for you to jump in on that.
Sure. So, I mean, we're not anti-government or anti-company, but we're basically asking a question. And the question is, what would it take to let everybody on the planet have an identity that belongs to them? And what we're observing is sometimes there's a confusion between identity and identifiers. And so you might have a phone number that it's an identifier, or an email address, or a tax ID. That's not your identity. Those are identifiers. And if you use those as your identity, it's very privacy degrading. And so we have reached a belief really based on how the internet got popular, which is how we went from having TCP/IP and got to the World Wide Web. And the World Wide Web is based on the namespace, the domain name system, that if you want to travel somewhere, you don't need to know a TCP/IP address. You just type in a name and you go somewhere. And there's only one Coca-Cola.com at any point in time. There's not like a Coca-Cola.com in Brazil and one in Mexico. It's just Coca-Cola.com. And our question would be, how would you make it possible for everybody in the world to have a unique name? And you can think of it as just like a Twitter handle or a Skype handle. And no, we can't all be Jim Smith. You might have to be Sir Jim Smith or, but their language is complex enough that we all could have a name, and we could even have multiple names. We could have a personal name and a business name. There's plenty of names to go around. And you could own that name. You could think of it as like a credential. You could think of it as an NFT. You could have a name for your 2-year-old. You could have your name for your 102-year-old who has dementia. And to that name, we would build a reputation that other people would trust. The purpose of the name is not so much just for us, it's for other people to say, oh, that's Joe, or, oh, that's the saber-toothed tiger with a bad temper. Like, knowing those things let you know, the relying party, whether you can trust that person well enough to either talk to them, exchange money with them, whatever that is. And so the construct is anybody can pick those names. It all runs through, you use a mobile phone number as an identifier. If you don't have a mobile phone, you just need to find someone who does, or have it do it, someone who does do it on your behalf. And even with a weak set of credentials, even if you just declare your name, address, and date of birth in an immutable way, in a form that you can access, then you're on the road to somewhere. And so even if you're a refugee, a person that comes from a very economically disadvantaged situation, somebody somewhere is going to have a piece of technology that connects you to the internet. And you are going to collect these Easter eggs in your Easter basket. And as long as you have them, you can present them in a persistent way, and that's your identity. And it might be a very weak form of identity, but maybe it's enough for you to start using a messaging system, right? I mean, anybody in the world previous who had 10 cents could put it in a telephone and talk on the phone system. It didn't matter if you were Osama bin Laden. They didn't build the phone system to say, well, bad people can't talk on the phone. Like, it was an inclusive system. And there's a lot of worry about having people able to do something like move money or hold money if they're on a bad list. And so you might say, for that list, you need to have a stated name and prove that you're not on a sanction list. And that's as simply as like looking up against that name for a location and saying, are you or are you not sanctioned? And even if you were sanctioned, there ought to be a way for people to say, I'm sending you money, you can't have it yet, but as soon as you get off the sanction list, the money is there waiting for you, right? And so there's been a debate between there was a really good debate for Sam before he got in all this trouble, and Eric from Shapeshift over regulation versus no regulation for DeFi. We see that as a false argument. We think not everything has to be fully regulated and locked down by CeFi central actors. And we also think that there's a problem with something being so deregulated that laws that apply for sanctions regimes can't be enforced. And so we see something in between. We see a world where there can be regulated DeFi, and the regulation can be voluntarily adhered to by organizations that, even though they're operating DeFi-like platforms like non-custodial wallets, can say, we're going to build into the smart contracts of our DeFi platform that unless you have enough credentials to prove that you're not on the sanctions list, you can't use the platform. And so it is still running with non-custodial wallets. It's running on blockchain, but you can have a form of identity proofing that says if you can't prove that you have an identity and you're not on a sanctions list, you can't hold funds in this non-custodial wallet. And those rules are built in at the ledger level. And, so you can be very, very inclusive, be self-sovereign, and yet still show that there's a path that the system that you built can actually exclude people that are on a sanctions list. And a purist will say, no, 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 we have to let people in, even if they're on a sanctions list. And a central actor will say, well, you can't do this unless you have centralized control over the ledgers with the balances. We would say both of that is hyperbole. You can create, with portable self-sovereign identity, a set of credentials that can show even a non-custodial wallet-based system can meet a compliance standard that the guys with guns and badges are going to be okay with. And so we're excited about building that out, giving people enough identity that everybody can have a seat at the table. Everybody can not just message, but they can hold money, and it's theirs. It doesn't belong to a single company or a single country. So let me pause there.
Is that in many ways, do you see that as being kind of the entry point going forward for a far more mainstream DeFi future? Because I think, one of the challenges, and obviously if you look at what happened with, and I know that the last panel touched upon that, one of the big challenges that happened with kind of the collapse of Celsius and obviously FTX is that it's been largely CeFi actors controlled by one very powerful founder, CEO, like literally no different than what we've seen happen in the past. And from a regulatory perspective, there are a few things that granted should be brought in terms of front running, but at the same time, like this was a centralized actor issue that is governed under current regulations. And so, I always say, fraud is a wonderful thing. Fraud is the most egalitarian concept I know. Fraud doesn't care about the underlying technology. Fraud doesn't care about the underlying assets that you're committing fraud on. Fraud is awesome. It just says, you know what, you can use me in literally any context you want. But as soon as we start looking at, everything that happened from a FTX perspective and apply that to even today's DeFi setup, I'm genuinely not sure how much of what happened with FTX could happen in a truly DeFi world.
Well, yeah, in a truly DeFi world, you've heard the expression, your keys, your money, or, and so this concept of somebody's sweeping all the balances and then on lending them without your permission, that couldn't happen, right? So that kind of pyramid scoop scheme can't happen. Now, the question is, if you're doing all that with, USDC that's sitting in non-custodial wallets with no identity credentials, you have a different problem, which is that, like, you don't know who you're like laundering money for. And you can be laundering it at great scale. And so you don't know who's running those nodes. You're in a world of hurt if you have an intention of actually attempting to have compliant transactions. Just imagine if you're Amazon and you're like, well, wow, great, we can take money from a Solana wallet in Brave, but by the way, that wallet doesn't have any identity, and we just took in $13 million, and we have no idea whether that money was from a compliant source or not. And so that might not matter if it's really small amounts of money and like nobody's yet looking at it. But when you get to scale, DeFi without identity breaks down because you just simply can't prove whether you're dealing with compliant or non-compliant counterparties. And yet the answer from our point of view isn't to like push DeFi back into CeFi. It's to basically figure out how to make DeFi compliant enough that you can use it. And it's as simple to use as like PayPal or Venmo. So it's got to get down to that level, or WeChat or Alipay, right? It should feel like for most people, they have like one currency, it might be dollar, it might be their local currency, maybe they have a crypto, but we're not talking about something super complicated here. And the fact that it's DeFi or that it's a non-custodial wallet, does the user even need to know that? right? Like, but what the user needs to know is like, my money isn't sitting at X or at Y, my money is sitting with me. And my keys, my money. And yet it still needs to have consumer protection, be compliant, et cetera. But it's a totally different world than what happened with, with FTX or Celsius.
But I think it's, I agree. It's really interesting that, we get into these conversations and we will use terms like DeFi, we will use terms like non-custodial wallets, we will use terms like KYC, AML. And to be very, very honest, 99% of the world's population that we want to bring in, because at the end of the day, it is democratization of access, it's democratization of opportunity. All of these first principles that we deeply care about, we end up using narrative, I think, that is in reality so exclusionary, right? Because at the end of the day, like you said, like the end user doesn't care, shouldn't care, the idea that, Rashida, the refugee, at the end of the day, yes, first principles means that we give her decentralized identity. First principles means that she cannot be targeted based upon the fact that now someone knows where she is. The fact that her data can be monetized, but should be monetized without her ever being compromised in any way. Those are all wonderful first principles. But like, she literally doesn't care about some of the principles of decentralization. She doesn't care what chain you deployed that on. She doesn't care that, Bitcoin is more decentralized, being proof of work than, a proof of stake system. Those things need to get abstracted. I know Delhi mentioned that in the earlier panel. It's not just how we build the product, how we make it so easy for people to be able to, create that ID and then be able to use it. It's about how we get that message to them. We ran a really interesting experiment very early in the life of Rainfall, where the whole idea was like, you should not sacrifice your privacy in the process of being able to monetize your data. And so it was privacy and then monetize, right? And what we learned working with, a whole bunch of moms that were the initial, pilot that we rolled out with, that we really had to flip the message. And it started out with monetize it. And then, by the way, you should monetize it responsibly because you need privacy. And the way to achieve that is X, Y, Z, if you're even interested. And I think from a DeFi perspective, like, on one hand, the idea that we can just be completely anonymous, run in a DAO without jurisdiction, and it will never touch any kind of sovereign state jurisdiction. I think, is there a path to that one day? Perhaps, and it honestly doesn't matter, right? Because we are going to live in a sensible hybrid world right now, where even today you can have anonymous transactions on chain, and as soon as you want to take that money out, or you want to enter into a fiat world, you need to have full KYC and AML, right? And I think that the path forward is that, we will step away from some of the centralized actors operating in a decentralized guise, like what we saw with FTX. We will move to the model that you said, where you will have your own identity, you will manage that identity, and you will make it available every time you want to interact in a transaction on a whatever your choice of DeFi platform. And it's perfectly okay to have that hybrid world.
So we have sort of a simplifying concept between, people may have heard of verifiable credentials. It's a way of collecting a credential and proving that it's true. And it's a kind of a WC3 standard, but it's very, very precise and detailed. And it's kind of overkill for when somebody says, I want to buy a banana. Can I buy a banana? And, and the party that's selling the banana is like, I need to know that the money you're sending me is good. And I need to know, just to make sure that by selling it to you, I'm not committing a crime by selling it to someone who's on a list that says no bananas for so-and-so, right? And so rather than like share all the data in the credential, what we're suggesting is when you collect these credentials, it gets you to a level of trust. And you could say bronze might be very low level, but some trust, and then silver is more, it might involve more credentials or more historical data, and then gold would be higher. And, you know, if all you need to know to make a decision, should I deal with this person or not, is like, are they bronze or not? It really minimizes the amount of information that would have to be shared and put at risk from a privacy or fraud point of view. And so the limits might be pretty low on bronze. And let's just be clear what bronze might be. Maybe I round trip my phone number and I declared, I didn't prove my name, address, and date of birth. And you might say, well, that's pretty weak. It's a phone number and some declared information, and you check the name against the sanction list. And you got to remember, though, people, yeah, they could lie, but when they lie on the blockchain and create an identity, they just lied for life. And everything they do thereafter with that identity is going to have to square up. And so you spend your whole life trying to like work around, you know, a miscommunicated address, date of birth, and name. Well, good luck. And, you know, your limit might only be $500. And so we can make it cheaper to be good than to be bad. That's really, that may not sound like a very high moral standard, but if we make being compliant and good pretty easy and make being hard just a pain in the ass, that could take a lot of flutter and fraud out of the system. But it doesn't have to be more complicated than like, oh, this person's silver, so I'm comfortable doing something up to $5,000 for them. Like it's at that level. Now, if a bomb goes off, you know, or a bunch of people get kidnapped and you have to drill down on that name, the data is there. But it's not there for marketers or advertising. It's there because you have to file a suspicious activity report or run an investigation. So the party that's relying on that, for the time being, they just get the information that it's a silver badge, but they get a token. And with appropriate due diligence, there might even be a warrant involved, they can unpack the data and get additional information and cooperate with law enforcement. But, you know, that's the world that I would feel more comfortable living in.
From your perspective, then, does that become like minimum requirement? It's sort of the equivalent of, you know, like a product market fit for a Series A, or even a, you know, a concept fit for from a seed round parallel. Would that be kind of prerequisite for you when you look at how you invest going forward? Because it'd be great to just unpack some of what you see as kind of your focus areas for investable opportunities going out into the next 12, 18 months.
So it's really strange. A year ago, when everything in the market was flying and we were like, you know, at Solana's breakpoint in Portugal, it just like DeFi was all the rage, and you know, my balance sheet looked great. And you know, now here we are a year later. But the interesting thing is, at that time, we made a decision back then that, like, even though DeFi is going great, why don't we go in the other direction and do the most boring thing in the world, which is buy a bank in the United States, no less, sitting in a cornfield. And the question is, well, what the bank has to offer is something really boring, US dollars. Just like USDC is a US dollar stablecoin, but it's issued by a money transmitter, you know, Circle and Coinbase. And so it's not FDIC insured. It doesn't have the capital efficiency of a bank. It's certainly not compliant because, you know, maybe the first person who touched it's compliant, but there's nothing stopping that from ending up in an anonymous wallet. And it's not generally privacy preserving because, you know, it has all these different features, but it's pretty good. A lot of people use stable coins, but the question is, what's a better stable coin? Well, a bank is certainly not DeFi. It's certainly centralized. But what if you took a bank and it issued these tokens, but the tokens sat on a permissioned version of Ethereum? And the only permission on it was like, you need credentials to hold this. Otherwise, you know, you can hold it in a non-custodial wallet. And if you have those credentials, you don't have to be an American sitting in a cornfield. You can be anyone in the world. And so now anyone in the world in a non-custodial blockchain-based wallet could hold the most boring asset in the world, a US dollar that's FDIC insured. And I really mean everybody and anybody. So if you're in some country that has debased currency or, has political strife, like what one of our portfolio companies is Remittance, has 2.5 million users in the Ukraine. We have Colombia with Movie, the largest digital wallet there. We have 2 million users, many of whom are Venezuelan refugees. What all those people would like to hold is an FDIC insured bank-based dollar. What's their chance of doing that today without this new technology? Pretty much zero or less. But in this world, we could take the most boring thing in the world, which is US dollars that are FDIC backed, and put them on chain in a way that people with very minimal levels of identity, we call it bronze, where you're able to round trip a phone number and to clear some information about yourself. If you did that, then we see no reason why you shouldn't be able to hold up to like whatever the number is, $500 worth of this asset. And if you want to hold more, get more credentials. Maybe they're conventional government credentials, like a government driver's license, but maybe they're not. Maybe they're social media or other things where you've proved a persistent identity over a long period of time. Maybe you're an Uber driver, whatever those things are, to get a higher limit. And so now you've got a complete mix of really boring aspect of CeFi, but the most trusted boring form of CeFi, but you're mixing it with DeFi. You're mixing it with a ledger that people could hold in a self-sovereign manner. And then from our point of view, you're off to the races. And so there's been a criticism of Web3 and DeFi. And I think Jack Dorsey he said, all that Web3 stuff, the DeFi, that's all like the same people as CeFi. It's all Web 2.0 people doing the dance around DeFi. And you know what? He's right. It is true. It is me. I came up, I was in the Web 2.0 world. I worked at the Fed. I put first money into Coinbase and, and centralized social media. But like, I'm over that stuff. It's, so we have committed to the DeFi world. But the question is, what is the linking glue that gets you from that CeFi world into DeFi and out again, right? Like, we would like everyone to be able to permanently live in the DeFi world. We view the casino and the window where you go and get your poker chips, that's CeFi. You go to the casino, you give them the money, they give you the chips. But once you sit down at the poker table, everything at the poker table is DeFi. You win a hand, you get chips. You lose a hand, you and you don't need anybody else. You might have a dealer, but a friendly poker game, the players can deal themselves and everybody can like settle, clear right then and there. We think that the future and what DeFi represents is that 99% of human activity will happen at the poker table. And rarely will there be a need to like go and check things out, cash things out at the CeFi level. But, if there's a big thing of like, okay, somebody bought these chips and they did it with counterfeit money, or we think they're like laundering money for the mob, or like, you can still figure out, okay, well, whose chips, where are they sitting? Go get that guy, right? And so that's not a world that's going to sound like appealing to a purist who thinks like there should be no regulation, no controls. And, it still can sound a little nerve-wracking to people that like are used to like controlling everything. And yet people are sitting over there at the poker table and we're not, as the casino, really controlling what's going on in the poker table. But that's the interesting middle world between like the shapeshift view of the world, no regulation, and the world that Sam was peddling, like regulation. We think there's a nice in-between perch.
I agree entirely. I mean, when we look at the investment opportunities that we're focused on for the next, call it 12, 18 months, and, like Shelley mentioned in the introduction, we apply a 10-year lens. Mm-hmm. Because, if you don't apply a 10-year lens to and I would say the category is still not defined yet. Yes, we loosely call it decentralized finance, and we've got, other aspects of it. It gets me really excited when we start making the transitions from building and investing in the infrastructure layers to starting to see where they're being applied, right? Whether it's in enterprise or whether it is in community, whether it is in some of the planetary challenges we have today, when it starts getting applied in these vertical opportunities, whether it is with consumers or whether it is within companies, you start to really unlock the theory into practice. And what we find there is infrastructure then needs to kind of have its layer 2 or layer 2.5 show up. That's when we start seeing, some of the assumptions that we have made pan out or not. And the smart companies start to make those quick pivots and adjustments. And then I think that's where the category not only gets created, but the category starts having its meaningful leaders. And from a DeFi perspective, I think we're very early there, but we've started seeing some of that infrastructure get built up. We've started seeing some of those players who've, already made their initial alpha. And so we're certainly starting to look now far more into the companies that are, where the rubber meets the road. They're coming to us with really, really specific use cases for specific markets. And the investment opportunities there, start to, I think, expand massively, because on the infrastructure side, you'll end up with, maybe, 5, 10, 15, 20 players building something very interesting and tweaking things that have already been built. Because we all have access, we get to go into those deals early. In your case, how many Coinbase opportunities have panned out since, right? But like that verticalization, you start seeing so many companies come up in so many different areas. Are there areas that you're looking at that you go, so excited, seeing 5, 6, 7, 10 companies that are doing really cool stuff? That's where I want to put my money to work now.
So we still love marketplaces and ones that are decentralized. So we're looking at eventually the decentralized version of everything from, like, what's the decentralized version of Uber look like? What's the decentralized version of Airbnb? Anything where you're taking out the middleman. We're kind of unhappy that FTX blew up because they had a project Serum, which was going to be like a distributed exchange built on top of Solana. And, with them out of the picture, that money evaporates. That to us looks like a temporary setback. But we look at a world where if Oprah says, hey, I like this cat video, and you click on it, the money moves from your non-custodial wallet to the producer of the cat videos wallet, and Oprah gets her cut, and there's no Netflix, and Apple's not in the loop, and even the browsers, like Apple's not in the loop because of the App Store, but they're not in the loop because of Safari or Google because of Chrome, and nobody's personal information was sold. I just paid 8 cents to watch the cat video, right? And because I wanted to, and Oprah got some money, and the cat film, that flat world. That may not sound like a very exciting milestone, but the ability to disintermediate all the traditional Web 2.0 actors is fascinating to us. And so we're all in on anybody that's building a value proposition that can happen without reliance on a central intermediary for everyone to trust. We want the trust to be built directly between the payee and the payor, the sender and the receiver, right? And people complain sometimes when I'm at these meetings, like, well, blockchain, it's slow and it's expensive. I'm like, yeah, but you don't have to ask permission to innovate. That's the innovation. We'll get the price down later and the speed up. But the ability to innovate without having to ask permission to innovate, that's the radical thing that started with Bitcoin and now is evident in some of these other DeFi projects. That is transformative of not having to ask permission to innovate. It's such a simple thing, but just imagine what the world would be like if every innovation in it, you had to ask somebody who probably is going to be threatened by the innovation, may I have permission to innovate? And so I'm going to basically marginalize and disrupt your inherent advantage in the marketplace. Wouldn't that be nice? Like, no, they're going to say no. And so anybody that's a disruptor in that regard, that's promoting the creator at the expense of the rent-seeking intermediary. And we're not, I know I'm using like loaded words, but we're not against the fact that there are intermediaries, but we think like Apple taking 3,000 basis points on a transaction is a little too much, maybe 10 basis points, but 3,000? It seems a little, it's one thing to have Tony Soprano as a neighbor, but like, it's another thing to have Tony Soprano like in every aspect of your life. It's just too much. So
Well, and what's
Yeah.
and I agree, and what's interesting is, it's not just in our little echo chambers where we're having these conversations, right? Like if you look at it globally, there is I always like to focus on zeitgeist. The social cultural tea leaves are supporting the conjecture that we're making, right? That people around the world, even generationally, are moving to this mindset. They may not know the technology that enables it, and they don't know which product will end up being that decentralized app store. And we now have this permission to innovate, as you say. But we're not swimming upstream anymore. And that's that really excites me, because the cultural zeitgeist is leaning towards what I call the people's revolution or the commons revolution. And we now have permission to build to enable it. And that's such a great place to be right now, both as a creator as well as, an investor.
Agreed. I think we're getting close to the end. Were we supposed to take any questions, or what was the
Well,
format?
yes, we were, but I think between the conversation that you both had, you covered most of the questions that people might have had. And we are at time. The following panel is coming in at 1 o'clock precisely with Matthew Lemerle and Bill Saris. I want to have a quick response from both of you. Is if you were to look in 2023 and 2024, one word, 2 words, or a sentence of advice for investors looking out into that next 24-month window.
Bargain basement, right? Like if you look long term, what a great time to get in. This is an exciting time for us to get in. Don't be distracted by the big shiny objects that will keep coming on, especially in the decentralized space. And most of the time, invest in businesses that you can truly believe in, because you can connect the asset with the underlying business. And I think that's the big shift compared to 2016, 2017.
For me, I'm looking for the first DeFi product that somebody can use without knowing what DeFi is. Just like, just everyday people doing something. Hey, this product's good for listening to music or buying something or finding something. And the fact that it was DeFi behind the scenes, they're like, oh, really? Who cares? Like that's the point in the challenge. And obviously we're looking for the first wallets that basically are Venmo and Square-like, but the fact that you will hold the keys is neither here nor there. Like you will, and but really what people are just going to care about is, can I use this wallet like any other, right? And so that's what we're hoping 2023 and 24 is about. If crypto winter is long, you should, bring an extra pair of gloves if it is going to last longer. That's all I can say.
Thank you both. I hope it's short. Thank you, Amit. Thank you, Greg.